This video is going to look at the 1851 Fort Laramie Treaty, and we'll think about whether or not it resolved tensions between the US and the Plains Indians. So what was the need for the Fort Laramie Treaty? What had happened? Why had tension increased between the Plains Indians and the United States? Well, there's a whole host of reasons. I think crucial to underpinning this, of course, is the gold rush, which massively increased settlement through the plains to California, large numbers of migrants traveling across the Oregon Trail. And that's at the root of a lot of these issues. We've got a lot of tribal conflicts, of course, between the Plains Indians tribes. Like all humans, from time to time, Plains Indians also engage in conflict and violence against each other. And sometimes the white settlers would, as they're traveling the plains, get caught up in this or get concerned that they were going to be attacked somehow. And there was a desire from the white settlers to have peace on the plains, to ensure that the conflict involving Plains Indians, whether it was against whites or whether it was against themselves, was subdued in some way. So there was a desire to resolve that problem as the whites perceived it to be. White settlers, frankly, were also quite racist towards the Plains Indians. They viewed them as essentially barbarian savages, violent, warlike. They also feared the Plains Indians as well, so they thought they were sort of lesser than, if you like, intellectually, but they also feared them as well. They kind of had perceptions of what the Plains Indians were like that really were not borne out by reality, but it was the fears of those white settlers that were very influential in pushing the government to try to come up with some kind of solution. Buffalo hunting was also an issue. Whites traveling the plains would interfere with the ability of Plains Indians to hunt the buffalo. Whites bringing their animals across the plains, their oxen, their horses, would lead to issues of overgrazing of the land, which again was problematic for the Plains Indians, who also relied on horses that needed the grass to graze on, as well as obviously the buffalo that relied on the supplies of the grass as well. And the Oregon Trail was also increasingly becoming militarized. The US was building forts on the trail to protect the settlers. And they're basically building bases in the land of the Plains Indians. You can imagine the Plains Indians were not terribly happy about that. So there was desire to come up with a solution, and that's basically what the Fort Laramie Treaty is trying to do. This first Fort Laramie Treaty of 1851, and we can see that the terms of the treaty there. So in straightforward terms, the idea was that the Indians would stop fighting amongst themselves. Bits of land would be parceled out to different Indian tribes that they were meant to stay within. We'll see why that was flawed in a minute. Migrants would be allowed to travel through their land to California in safety. Remember, at this point, the migrants, they're only really at this point only interested in traveling through the plains. The US in 1851 doesn't quite yet see the plains as being of value in terms of being somewhere that they want to settle on itself. It's just you've got to get through it to get to California, although that's going to change pretty quickly, as we'll see. They want to, the Indians would allow railroad surveyors to come in and scout their land for possible routes for a railroad, which obviously we'll know will be completed in the 1860s. They want the US is able to get the Indians to allow the government to build roads through their lands and construct army posts. And the Indians would pay compensation if any of their tribes broke the treaty terms by attacking white migrants. In exchange, the US government would protect Indians from white Americans. They would stop white Americans from settling on their land, and they would pay the tribes an annuity, a yearly payment of $50,000, so long as the Indians would stick to the terms of the treaty. But as we'll see, there were lots of problems. For one example, trying to divide up the Plains Indians' land, like we can see on the map on the right, just didn't work. The Plains didn't perceive land in that way. They didn't think you could have borders and parcels of land that this bit's for this group and this bit's for another group. They were nomads. They wandered the plains after the buffalo. That meant sometimes wandering into and out of places that were strongholds of other tribes. That obviously led to conflict from time to time. So the boundaries that were created were seen as a bit of a joke essentially, and not really worth the paper they were written on. Although from the white point of view, it begins to pave the way for the idea of reservations in terms of identifying which bits of land should, in the view of the whites, belong to which group of Indians. But there are all kinds of problems as well. I mean, the fact that the tribal structure of the Plains Indians was an issue in terms of the chiefs going to negotiate with the U.S. government, but not all of the Plains Indians feel as though they have to follow what the chief says. You have language problems as well. Not every tribe sending a representative, so there are lots of issues with the negotiations for this treaty. And it doesn't work. It doesn't ultimately keep the peace, as we'll see later on. The US in particular repeatedly violates the treaty and basically sort of finds reasons to not stop US settlers colonizing further areas of land. The treaty in the end becomes an inconvenient thing that needs to be changed or removed entirely as we move later on into the period. It tried to create a peaceful resolution. It maybe keeps the peace for a short time, but ultimately, very quickly after it was ratified, the treaty was violated. And particularly when we get developments like the Pikes Peak gold rush in the late 1850s, the big gold rush to Colorado, we start to see that the Fort Laramie Treaty, again, is another one of these documents that's not really worth the paper it's written on. And that then facilitates some of the conflicts of the 1860s that we'll get to in our next video.